Several years ago, where I was working, I had the opportunity to travel north of San Francisco into Sonoma Valley and then on north to Napa. And, of course, when you go through that countryside, all you see are vineyards. Everywhere are vineyards. Vineyards have been with us for a very long time. They were in Israel. They were in Palestine for years and years, and they were a very important part of that culture. And because they were such an important part of that culture, the writers of the Old and New Testament often used vineyards to teach lessons. And tonight's lesson is simply called God's Vineyard. And the particular vineyard that we're talking about tonight is Israel. Because Israel was called God's vineyard. The prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 5, uses that expression. And I hope you brought your Bibles tonight, and I'm sure you did. And I encourage you to turn to Isaiah chapter 5 as we talk about lessons from God's vineyard. Because they were so important to that society and that economy, they were very carefully taken care of, cared for, protected. They were that important. In that part of the world, the grapes were harvested just shortly before one of the main feasts that the Israelites were to observe, and that was the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes called the Feast of Booths. And so right after this great harvest, then this feast came where the people lived in these temporary shelters as a reminder of their past. And so these grapes, the vineyards, formed such an important part of their lives, and they were a sign, a symbol of prosperity to those people. And so the prophet Isaiah uses a vineyard to teach Israel, and then of course indirectly us, a very valuable lesson. A very valuable lesson about what God does and what He does for us in particular. We're going to begin in Isaiah chapter 5, and we're going to begin by looking at the first two verses, because the first two verses show us God's care for the vineyard, how concerned He was for it. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1. Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. The first thing you see here, of course, is how concerned God is for the vineyard. How concerned the gardener is, the owner is, for his vineyard. He loves it. He cares for it. He's concerned about it. The psalmist wrote about this very similarly in Psalms chapter 80, when he wrote in verses 8 and 9 about God and His vineyard. In Psalms 80, verses 8 and 9, the psalmist says this. Psalms 80, verses 8 and 9. You have brought a vine out of Egypt. You've cast out the nations and planted it. You prepared room for it and caused it to take deep root, and it filled the land. Of course, that vine that came out of Egypt was Israel. God was taking care of it and protecting it from day one. And so He brought it into the land of Canaan, into the promised land, and planted it. Again, it shows how careful God was watching over and taking care of Israel. This vineyard had many advantages. We read about some of those advantages. It had so many of them. The owner obviously cared for it deeply. If you would go to a store today, a greenhouse, and buy the most expensive plant they had, and it might cost you thousands of dollars. See, I'm talking expensive plant. When you got it home, what would you do? Just leave it on the front porch and forget about watering it and so forth? Obviously not, because it cost you thousands of dollars. You would take very, very good care of it. You would watch over it and make sure it was protected, make sure nothing got in and chewed its leaves or broke its branches or anything. I mean, you would be very cautious and careful because of its value. Well, that's what the writer here, Isaiah, is trying to convey. This is how well God thought of Israel. God said, I've done all of these things for you. I've planted you on a fruitful hill. I've done all of these things. This was the choicest vine. Jeremiah uses a similar expression in chapter 2 in talking about Israel. And he says, Israel is a noble vine, a seed of the highest quality. That's what God thought of Israel. The choicest vine, a noble vine, the highest quality vine. It's like of all the vines out there, Israel was the choicest. And so God spent so much in taking care of it. He says in this that he dug up the land, cleared out the stones. He wanted the land to be perfectly fit for planting. It says the gardener here removed everything, every weed, every rock, anything that would inhibit the growth, the gardener removed. And that's exactly what God did. Many nations had been dug out of Canaan to make room for Israel. We know from studying Deuteronomy in our morning class on Sunday that when the people are getting ready to go into Palestine, that there were going to be all these nations, and God said, if you follow me, follow my directions, I will dig all of these nations out. And that's what Isaiah was talking about here. God did all of this for you, Israel. See, this is directed to God's people. God did all of this. God dug out all of those nations. God got rid of the weeds. God cultivated you and protected you and did everything for you imaginable. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, I want us to read verses 37 and 38 of that, where we are told by Moses what God was going to do. The 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 37. Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we'll read verses 37 and 38. Moses says, "And because he loved your fathers," talking about God, "therefore he chose their descendants after them, and he brought you out of Egypt with his presence, with his mighty power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land as an inheritance, as it is this day." And of course, when we read Joshua and Judges, we read about all the battles that God fought for them, all the kings that were slain, the cities that were captured, and on, how God was doing just what Isaiah said God had done for them. Dug out all the rocks and the weeds so that the land was perfect. And God was going to take care of them. So the first lesson we need to get from these first two verses is this: are we bearing fruit considering all the advantages we possess? And do we possess advantages? We have so many resources, we have so many opportunities, we have so many privileges. So many. So are we taking advantage of them? And when God looks down at our lives, or the church as a whole, does He see us bearing the kind of fruit that He would want? And there's many types of fruit the Bible talks about. Of course, there's the fruit of the Spirit that we read in Galatians chapter 5, I think it's verses 22 and 23. Things like love and peace and gentleness. Are we producing those in our lives, and when people look at us and they see our behavior and what we talk about and what it appears is important to us, would they say yes? Those people are bearing the fruit of peace and self-control and gentleness, joy. But also, a fruit would be promoting the kingdom. Are we doing that? Are we promoting the kingdom by how we live? Are we doing what we can to spread the boundaries of the kingdom, to enlarge it? It's never easy, but also when you think about going into wild land that's never been cultivated, there's a lot of work you have to do, isn't there? A lot of rocks, a lot of old stumps, maybe a lot of weeds that has to be taken out. So there's a lot of effort involved. It doesn't come easy to have a great harvest. There's work involved. There's work involved in producing the fruit of the Spirit. God doesn't miraculously give us the fruit of the Spirit. We must work for it. Same way for the kingdom. We want the kingdom to increase and to grow. There's work involved. So God expected from Israel a great harvest. He expected obedience to His Word. He expected them to love Him as the Heavenly Father. They expected them to worship Him as the only true God. But what does the text say He received? Wild grapes. Bitter grapes, noxious grapes, foul-smelling grapes. These were the grapes that would have been produced if the gardener had done absolutely nothing. He had just let everything alone. Those are wild grapes. And when you look at the original Hebrew words, the idea is something that stinks, something that smells bad. That's the kind of fruit that was produced. If nothing had been done, but just the opposite had been done. God, the owner, the gardener, had done a huge amount of work in preparing the land. He had given Israel everything. He had provided everything for them. So it was natural for Him to expect a great harvest. And He should have. But that's not what He got. He got disobedience, He got rebellion, He got idolatry, and those were all wild grapes. Those were bitter fruit. Those were noxious fruit. Those were foul-smelling fruit. Not what He should have gotten. Again, when we go back to Deuteronomy, toward the very end of that book, Deuteronomy chapter 32, we have God speaking, and He tells them about the future. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 32. Notice what He says. Verse 32. For their vine is of the vine of Sodom and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall, their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of cobras. That's a good description of wild grapes, of bitter fruit. If you would go to the trouble of again, buying the most expensive plant and taking care of it, putting it in perfect soil that had been so carefully prepared, and making sure it had just the right amount of food and just the right amount of water, what would you expect? A great harvest. That's what God expected. And that's what Israel should have produced, but they didn't. They gave God wild grapes, bitter fruit, rebellion, sin, idolatry. The next couple of verses shows God's frustration with the vineyard. Verses 3 and 4 of our text. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? The Israelites knew how much work it took to grow a vineyard. It usually took at least 2 years for grapes to be produced from the time they were planted. Here, he's basically saying, look, Israel, look at everything that's been done. Is there anything that I could have done that I didn't? He says, judge yourselves. Is there anything more I could have done for you? And of course, it was really a rhetorical question because there wasn't. God said, I've done everything for you. I've provided everything for you. Why did you give me bad fruit? Stinking fruit. Why did you do that? So judge yourselves. Had God taken care of every need? Hadn't He watched over and protected them in every way? They'd been given every chance to be fruitful. Every possible chance. But their lack of good fruit was plain. Notice, beginning in verse 8 of Isaiah 5, there's a series of woes. Woe to those who join house to house, they add field to field, till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. Verse 11, woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night, till wine inflames them. Woe, woe. Verse 18, woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as if with a cart rope, that say, let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it. And let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come, that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. Those are some of the wild grapes they had produced. Those were some of the stinking grapes they had produced. Those were some of the examples of the sin and rebellion and idolatry that they had given God back in return. God is frustrated with them. God says, I've done and I've done and I've done. I couldn't have done anything more. Why did you repay me like this? That's what He's asking them. Why? So He's frustrated with them. What we take from this, every person has the chance of being fruitful. We're all God's choicest vine. Each of us are the most expensive plant in the greenhouse. Every one of us. And He's given us resources. He's given us opportunities. He's given us all kinds of advantages. The Bible says it is possible to receive God's grace in vain. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, the first 2 verses, Paul tells the church in Corinth that it is possible to receive God's grace in vain. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we'll read the first 2 verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, the first 2 verses. Paul writes, we then, as workers together with him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in an acceptable time I've heard you, in the day of salvation I've helped you. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. It says we can receive the grace of God in vain. What does that look like? What does that look like in people's lives? Have we given God hardness of heart instead of repentance? Have we given God indifference instead of love? Have we given God idleness instead of service? What have we given God? And then finally, the last 3 verses of our text, God talks about the future for the vineyard. Verse 5, and now please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I'll lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug up, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are His pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold, oppression. For righteousness, but behold, a cry for help. God says, This hedge of protection that I've built around you is going to be removed. And of course it was removed, wasn't it? First Assyria came and took the 10 northern tribes into captivity. And then Babylon came in and took the 2 southern tribes. So that hedge of protection, that wall of protection, God said, I'm removing. I'm taking it down. No more protection for you. You need to learn a lesson. And of course, that's why He did it. They were going to be trampled by foreign powers. Back in Psalm 80, that same psalm we looked at momentarily, in verses 12 and 13 of that same psalm, the psalmist writes, "Why have you broken down her hedges, so that all who pass by the way pluck her fruit? The boar out of the woods uproots it, and the wild beast of the field devours it." Well, that's what Isaiah is talking about. Foreign powers would come in and trample the vineyard. Trample the vineyard. And if you've ever planted a garden and had cows get out and get in your garden, you know what it looks like. Because that's what he's talking about. The wild boars getting in and trampling it. So God said, I'm going to take down that wall of protection. I'm going to take down the towers so that these powers, Assyria and Babylon and such, can come in and trample you. Why? Because they hadn't produced good grapes, the right kind of harvest. Barrenness would result. Things would be barren in their land. He says, I'm going to let the thorns and the weeds and everything come back. Let them regrow. He says, I looked for justice, but what did I get? I got oppression. That's what I got in return. I was looking for good grapes, justice. I got wild grapes, oppression. That's what you did to others. You oppressed them. He says, I was looking for righteousness, good grapes, but what did I get? A cry for help. Distress. He says, that's what I was looking for, was righteousness. It's interesting, there's a great word play in the Hebrew language here. When you look at the Hebrew word for justice and the Hebrew word for oppression, they're almost identical. I could just barely tell the difference between them. The same way with righteousness and the cry for help. So he's making a word play. He said they look alike, but they're very different. You might see 2 grapes. They might look very good. Have you ever eaten 2 grapes? One was so sweet, you bite into the other one, you just gag. But outwardly, they kind of look the same. So he says, I wanted good grapes, but look, you gave me wild grapes, bitter grapes, foul-smelling grapes. I should have had a great harvest, Israel, but what did you give me? You gave me all of these stinking fruit. God has given us so much. He's given us the way of salvation. He's poured blessings upon us. All of those blessings, Ephesians chapter 1, beginning in verse 3 and all the way down to verse 10. All of those wonderful things we have in Christ. Redemption and forgiveness and salvation. On and on and on. All of these wonderful things. God expects good grapes. He expects a great harvest. He expects faith and obedience. But shouldn't He? He's done so much for us. He's provided so much for us. We don't have to go out into our field and find sheep and or lambs and cattle and so forth and take them to some temple and sacrifice them. He asks us to partake of the fruit of the vine and the unleavened bread every Lord's Day. He asks us to return to Him a part of what He's blessed us with during the week. That list could go on. He has blessed us in so many ways. What kind of harvest are we giving Him back? Does He look at our vineyard and is He pleased with the wonderful harvest, the good grapes? Or does He look down and see these wild grapes, these noxious, bitter grapes? The Bible talks so much about bearing fruit. Jesus used it in John 15 when He talks about how His people are to be attached to the vine. If we're going to live, we've got to be attached to the vine. But what happens if those branches don't produce fruit? By inspiration, John records that Jesus said they're going to be cut off and burned. What we do in this life does matter. Our actions matter. What we say matters. What we think matters. All of those things matter. But they're so small compared to what's already been done for us. Jesus has provided the way. The Hebrew writer talks about how He's cleared the way to heaven for us. He desires faith in Him and obedience. Is that too much to ask? I don't think so. I hope all of this lesson has caused us to think about our harvest. There is a great day coming. There's a great day coming. And we want in our life to produce a harvest that He's accepting. We want it to be acceptable to Him. And tonight, if there is a need in your heart to respond, then we encourage you to do just that as we stand and sing this song. So small.